While the world runs from pain, the ancient Stoics ran toward it, not because they were masochists or gluttons for punishment, but because they had discovered something that modern society desperately wants to hide from you. Pain is not your enemy. Your avoidance of pain is your prison. Every comfort you seek, every difficulty you avoid, every shortcut you take to escape discomfort is another bar in the cage that keeps you weak, dependent, and controlled by forces outside yourself. The Stoics understood that freedom isn't the absence of pain, it's the mastery of pain, and the person who can embrace suffering voluntarily becomes immune to the suffering that life inevitably imposes. This isn't about becoming numb or emotionless. This is about discovering that on the other side of every pain you refuse to face lies a power you've never accessed. But here's what they don't want you to know. A society of people who embrace pain cannot be controlled through fear, cannot be manipulated through comfort, and cannot be enslaved through convenience. The Stoics were the freest people who ever lived, not because their lives were easy, but because they had learned to find strength in struggle, wisdom in wounds, and liberation in the very experiences that break weaker souls. If you're ready to discover why embracing pain is the secret to ultimate freedom, and how the Stoics used voluntary suffering to become mentally unbreakable, hit that like button. Share this forbidden wisdom with someone who's ready to stop running from difficulty. Comment below about what pain you've been avoiding that might be your path to power, and subscribe to this channel for more hidden truths that will transform your relationship with struggle forever. Marcus Aurelius wrote these words that scholars still struggle to understand. The universe is transformation. Our life is what our thoughts make it, but transformation requires friction, and friction always involves pain. The emperor wasn't speaking philosophically. He was revealing a tactical secret that separated the rulers from the ruled. Marcus understood that every person alive is engaged in a constant battle against pain. Physical discomfort, emotional suffering, mental anguish, social rejection, financial pressure, spiritual emptiness. Most people spend their entire lives trying to win this battle by avoiding pain, but Marcus had discovered the ultimate paradox. The only way to defeat pain is to surrender to it completely. And in that surrender, you find a freedom that those still fighting the battle can never experience. The forbidden truth that the Stoics discovered is this: pain is not punishment, it's information, and the person who learns to read pain's message becomes wiser, stronger, and more powerful than those who spend their energy trying to silence the messenger. Every pain you feel is your body, mind, or spirit trying to tell you something crucial about reality, about your limitations, about what needs to change, about what you need to develop. But modern society has taught you to medicate pain, distract from pain, avoid pain, anything except listen to what pain is trying to teach you. Let me tell you about Sarah, a woman who discovered this forbidden truth through the darkest experience of her life. Sarah was a successful marketing executive who had built her entire identity around being strong, independent, and in control. She had the perfect apartment, the perfect career, the perfect relationship, everything arranged to minimize discomfort and maximize pleasure. Then, in a single month, everything collapsed. Her company was acquired and her position eliminated. Her fiancé left her for someone younger. Her mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Her carefully constructed life of comfort and control disintegrated, leaving her drowning in pain she had never learned to handle. Sarah's first instinct was what society had taught her: escape the pain. She tried therapy to talk away the hurt, medication to numb the anguish, travel to distract from the emptiness, shopping to fill the void, dating apps to replace the relationship, anything to get back to the comfort she had lost. But the pain followed her everywhere, because pain isn't something you can outrun. It's something you carry inside you until you finally stop running and face it directly. After months of failed escape attempts, Sarah was more broken than when she started, because she had exhausted herself fighting an unwinnable war. Then Sarah discovered what the Stoics had known for centuries. The moment you stop running from pain and start walking toward it, everything changes. Instead of avoiding her grief about her mother's condition, Sarah spent hours sitting with the sadness, feeling it completely, learning what it was trying to teach her about love, loss, and the precious nature of time. Instead of distracting herself from the humiliation of losing her job, Sarah examined the shame directly and discovered that her entire self-worth had been built on external achievements rather than internal strength. Instead of medicating the loneliness after her relationship ended, Sarah explored the solitude and found parts of herself she had never known existed. What Sarah discovered was revolutionary. Pain wasn't destroying her. Avoiding pain was destroying her. The moment she stopped fighting her suffering and started learning from it, she began to develop capacities she never knew she possessed. The grief taught her compassion. The failure taught her resilience. The loneliness taught her self-reliance. The uncertainty taught her adaptability. Within a year, Sarah had become a completely different person, not because her circumstances had improved, but because her relationship with difficulty had transformed. She had found the secret that made the Stoics free. Pain is not your enemy, it's your teacher, and the lessons it offers are available nowhere else. Seneca understood this so deeply that he deliberately practiced what he called the rehearsal of evils, voluntarily subjecting himself to discomfort, poverty, hunger, and social rejection, not because he enjoyed suffering, but because he knew that voluntary pain creates immunity to involuntary pain. Seneca wrote, "Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" But what Seneca was really doing was far more sophisticated than simple preparation. He was discovering that the person who has chosen pain cannot be controlled by the threat of pain. This is the forbidden aspect of Stoic practice that modern self-help culture refuses to acknowledge. True strength doesn't come from avoiding difficulty. It comes from seeking difficulty deliberately and finding your power within it. The Stoics knew that every comfort you depend on is a potential weakness. Every pleasure you can't live without is a form of slavery, and every pain you refuse to face is a source of fear that others can use to manipulate you. But the person who has voluntarily experienced loss cannot be threatened with loss. The person who has chosen discomfort cannot be controlled through comfort, and the person who has embraced pain cannot be broken by suffering. Let me share the story of Marcus, a modern man who accidentally discovered this principle through extreme circumstances. Marcus was a software engineer living the typical comfortable life of a tech worker: high salary, flexible schedule, all the conveniences that money could buy. But Marcus was miserable in ways he couldn't articulate. He felt weak, purposeless, disconnected from any sense of meaning or strength. He had everything that society promised would make him happy, but he felt like he was slowly suffocating in his own comfort. Then Marcus made a decision that everyone around him thought was insane. He quit his job, sold his possessions, and spent a year living as simply as possible, working manual labor jobs, sleeping in cheap motels, eating basic food, stripping away every comfort and convenience he had become dependent on. His friends thought he was having a breakdown. His family was concerned about his mental health, but Marcus was conducting the most important experiment of his life, discovering who he was beneath all the layers of comfort and convenience. What Marcus found in that year of voluntary hardship was transformative. He discovered that he was far stronger than he had believed, far more resourceful than he had imagined, and far more resilient than his comfortable life had ever allowed him to demonstrate. The physical discomfort taught him that his body was capable of much more than he had demanded from it. The financial limitation taught him to distinguish between wants and needs, between convenience and necessity. The social isolation taught him to find strength within himself rather than seeking validation from others. The uncertainty taught him to adapt and improvise rather than relying on predetermined plans and safety nets. By the end of the year, Marcus had become a completely different person. Not because he had gained anything external, but because he had discovered capacities that comfortable living had kept dormant. When he returned to his career, he was no longer desperate for security because he knew he could survive without it. He was no longer afraid of failure because he had learned that he could handle loss. He was no longer dependent on others' approval because he had found his own source of strength. Marcus had used voluntary pain to purchase freedom from involuntary fear, and that transaction had transformed him from a comfortable slave into an uncomfortable free man. Epictetus, who had experienced the ultimate pain of literal slavery, understood this principle from the most extreme perspective possible. He knew that the person who has accepted the worst possible circumstances cannot be threatened with anything less severe. Epictetus wrote, "Wealth consists in not having great possessions, but in having few wants." But the deeper truth he was expressing is that the person who has learned to be content with little cannot be controlled through the promise of more, and the person who has learned to be strong in suffering cannot be weakened through the threat of pain. This is why the Stoics embraced physical training, mental challenges, social criticism, and voluntary discomfort. They were building immunity to the things that make most people controllable. They understood that every comfort you become attached to is a lever that others can use to manipulate you. Every pleasure you depend on is a weakness that can be exploited, and every pain you fear is a source of power for those willing to inflict it. But the person who has voluntarily experienced all these things has removed the levers, eliminated the weaknesses, and conquered the fears that keep others in bondage. The modern world has inverted this wisdom completely. We're taught that avoiding pain is wisdom, that seeking comfort is intelligence, that minimizing discomfort is the path to happiness. But the Stoics knew that this approach creates the opposite of what it promises. Instead of strength, it creates fragility. Instead of happiness, it creates anxiety. Instead of freedom, it creates dependence. The person who has never been cold cannot appreciate warmth. The person who has never been hungry cannot value food. And the person who has never suffered cannot understand joy. Let me tell you about Rebecca, a woman who learned this lesson through motherhood. Rebecca had always been someone who avoided pain at all costs, who chose the easy path whenever possible, who sought comfort and convenience in every aspect of her life. Then she became a mother, and motherhood forced her to confront pain in ways she had never imagined possible. The physical pain of childbirth, the emotional pain of sleepless nights with a crying baby, the mental pain of constant worry about another person's well-being, the social pain of losing her previous identity and freedom. At first, Rebecca fought against these pains, resented them, saw them as obstacles to the happiness she thought motherhood should bring. She tried to minimize the discomfort, delegate the difficult parts, find shortcuts around the suffering that seemed inherent in raising a child. But nothing worked because the pain wasn't accidental or avoidable. It was integral to the transformation that motherhood requires. Rebecca couldn't become a mother without experiencing the pain of letting go of who she had been before. Then Rebecca had an epiphany that changed everything. She realized that the pain wasn't preventing her from becoming a good mother. It was creating the good mother she was becoming. The physical exhaustion was building her capacity for sacrifice. The emotional vulnerability was teaching her unconditional love. The mental worry was developing her protective instincts. The social isolation was forcing her to find strength within herself rather than depending on external validation. Every pain she had been trying to avoid was actually sculpting her into someone stronger, wiser, and more capable than she had ever been. Rebecca learned to embrace the difficulties of motherhood, not as obstacles to overcome, but as opportunities to grow. She stopped trying to escape the discomfort and started learning from it. She discovered that the moments of greatest challenge were often the moments of greatest growth, that the experiences she had initially resented became the sources of her deepest strength. Rebecca had stumbled upon the Stoic secret. Pain is not the enemy of growth. It's the catalyst for growth, and the person who learns to work with pain rather than against it gains access to potentials they never knew existed. This is the heart of why Stoics embraced pain as the path to freedom. They understood that comfort is the enemy of capability, ease is the opposite of excellence, and convenience is the destroyer of character. Every time you choose the easy path, you become a little weaker. Every time you avoid discomfort, you become a little more fragile. Every time you seek the convenient solution, you become a little more dependent. But every time you choose difficulty voluntarily, you become a little stronger. Every time you embrace discomfort, you become a little more resilient. Every time you take the hard path, you become a little more free. The Stoics knew that freedom isn't the ability to do whatever you want. It's the ability to want whatever you're doing. And the only way to develop that ability is through the voluntary embrace of experiences that most people spend their lives trying to avoid. This is why Stoic training involved deliberate exposure to cold, heat, hunger, exhaustion, criticism, rejection, loss, and failure. They were not torturing themselves, they were immunizing themselves against the fears that make most people controllable and the dependencies that make most people weak. Marcus Aurelius practiced this when he would sleep on the ground instead of his comfortable bed, eat simple food instead of royal delicacies, wear rough clothing instead of fine garments. He wasn't punishing himself. He was ensuring that his happiness didn't depend on circumstances beyond his control. He was building the capacity to be content in any situation, which is the ultimate form of freedom, liberation from the need for specific conditions to be at peace. But the deepest level of this practice involves emotional and psychological pain, not just physical discomfort. The Stoics deliberately exposed themselves to criticism, rejection, humiliation, and social disapproval because they knew that the person who cannot be hurt by others' opinions cannot be controlled by others' approval. They practiced losing arguments, accepting insults, embracing failure. Not because they enjoyed these experiences, but because they knew that mastery over external circumstances begins with mastery over internal reactions. Let me share the story of David, a man who discovered this principle through professional failure. David had built a successful consulting business over 15 years, had achieved everything he thought he wanted: financial security, professional recognition, social status, respect from peers. Then a series of poor decisions, market changes, and bad luck combined to destroy everything he had worked for. David lost his business, his savings, his reputation, his sense of identity. He went from being someone people sought advice from to someone people avoided because his failure might be contagious. The pain of this reversal was overwhelming. The humiliation of admitting failure, the fear of financial ruin, the shame of disappointing family and friends, the anxiety about an uncertain future. David's first impulse was to hide from the pain, to make excuses, to blame external factors, to minimize his responsibility for the disaster. But none of these strategies provided relief because the pain wasn't just about external circumstances, it was about the collapse of his self-image and the exposure of his deepest insecurities. Then David made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of running from the pain, he decided to explore it fully. Instead of making excuses for his failure, he examined every mistake he had made with brutal honesty. Instead of hiding his humiliation, he openly acknowledged his errors to anyone who would listen. Instead of avoiding the anxiety about his future, he sat with the uncertainty and explored what it was teaching him about his attachments and fears. What David discovered through this process was remarkable. The pain he had been trying to escape was actually liberating him from illusions that had been limiting his potential for years. The failure showed him that his self-worth had been entirely dependent on external achievements, which meant he had been living as a slave to others' perceptions rather than as a free man following his own values. The humiliation revealed that he had been making decisions based on what would look impressive rather than what was actually wise. The uncertainty forced him to develop internal resources he had never cultivated because external success had made them seem unnecessary. David's embrace of his failure transformed him into someone far more capable and free than he had been during his previous success. He learned to make decisions based on internal values rather than external validation. He developed genuine confidence that didn't depend on others' approval. He built resilience that came from having survived his worst fears rather than avoided them. When David eventually rebuilt his career, he was operating from a completely different foundation. Not the fragile ego that needed constant external confirmation, but the solid core that had been forged in the fire of embraced failure. This is the ultimate secret of why Stoics embraced pain as the path to freedom. They understood that every fear you haven't faced controls you, every difficulty you haven't overcome limits you, and every pain you haven't accepted owns you. But when you voluntarily walk toward what you've been running from, when you deliberately choose what you've been avoiding, when you embrace what you've been resisting, you transform from a person who is controlled by circumstances into a person who cannot be controlled by anything external, because you've already faced everything internal that made you controllable. The Stoics discovered that freedom isn't a destination you reach. It's a capacity you develop, and that capacity is forged exclusively in the fire of difficulty willingly embraced. They knew that the person who can be happy only when circumstances are favorable is a slave to circumstances. But the person who has learned to find strength in struggle is free, regardless of what life presents. This is why they sought out challenges, welcomed criticism, accepted loss, and embraced uncertainty. Not because they were gluttons for punishment, but because they were students of liberation. Seneca wrote, "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end." But what he meant was deeper than simple change. He meant that every level of freedom requires the death of some form of attachment, and that death is always painful. The pain isn't accidental. It's essential, because freedom isn't something you gain. It's something you become by letting go of everything that makes you unfree. The Stoics embraced pain because they understood that on the other side of every attachment you release lies a level of liberation you cannot access any other way. The modern world promises freedom through the elimination of pain, but the Stoics knew that true freedom comes through the integration of pain. They didn't seek to eliminate suffering from their lives. They sought to eliminate their resistance to suffering, and in doing so, they discovered that suffering without resistance isn't suffering at all. It's simply experience, and experience without resistance becomes wisdom, and wisdom without attachment becomes freedom. This is why the Stoics were the freest people who ever lived. Not because their lives were easy, but because they had learned to be free regardless of whether their lives were easy or difficult, comfortable or challenging, pleasant or painful. And that is the ultimate liberation that transforms every experience into a teacher and every pain into a pathway to power.